We do apologize for the late start. Now let's get straight into Business Edge. In the aftermath of COVID-19, countries are searching high and low for ways to increase their revenue and cushion the continued effects of the pandemic as their economies struggle to rebound. While there was a focus on building the tax base and increasing tax revenue before the lockdowns and restrictions, there is a greater urgency to that aspect of the economy now. But there is one African country that seems to be taking a step back from the tax drive. Angola's President João Lourenço has announced that a revision of the country's value-added tax is underway. The aim? To reduce the VAT that Angolans pay. The president explained that the introduction of VAT in the last quarter of 2019 has already proved to be one of the main taxes in terms of revenue collection. The volume of collection for this class of taxes rose from 75 billion kwanzas, about $125.4 million per quarter, to around 145 billion kwanzas, that's $242.5 million. He added that the tax policy will continue to be modernized and that there have also been changes that make the taxation of corporate and family income fairer. What's behind the move to reduce VAT? What will the implications of this decision be? Today, we're looking at Angola's decision to reduce its value-added tax. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me on the show today is Mthwalo Msoni, economist and researcher. Mthwalo, welcome back to Business Edge. It's been a while since we've seen you. I think we just lost his connection there, but we're getting into the conversation around Angola's decision to reduce its value-added tax. And we'll get back into where Angola stands as it is. It was in 2019 that the country introduced the value-added tax. That's just about 3 years ago. And 3 years later, they're moving it from 14% to 5%. More than a 50% reduction in the value-added tax. Now, the country moved from a tax base that was, or rather a taxation system that was based on the Portuguese colonial tax system to one that has been in some form of reparation since 2014. Now, Angola was also one of the last African countries to introduce the value-added tax, with one of the lowest in the SADC region, that's the Southern African Development Community region. And this value-added tax replaced the consumption tax. Now, in replacing it, what did tax bring on board that the consumption tax did not have? And we'll also look at the approach that the Angolan government has taken in this particular implementation of VAT, and that's the slim approach. But before we get into that, I think we do have Mthwalo back now. Mthwalo, welcome once again to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's get straight into it. We've lost a bit of time, but we've seen that since about 2014, Angola, just like any other country that has various taxes and tax levels, has been reforming, has been modernizing its tax system, and they've made some major improvements in a while. So since that time, from 2014 to now, what have we been seeing when it comes to how Angola is doing with its taxation?
So the main focus has been digitalizing taxation, which has proved to be very important in most African setups. So the more your tax systems go digital, you use digital platforms and make it easy for taxpayers to pay their tax, it seems that even compliance levels are improving. Once you have compliance levels improving for tax payments, then you can free up some of your tax instruments, lower some of the tax mix that you have, because you then have more taxpayers paying and meeting up some of the revenue requirements you have. In the recent times, of course, one of the things that has been looked at for Angola has been lowering the VAT rate on essential commodity items and also items in strategic areas like the agriculture, forestry, and fishery sector.
Okay, so as I said earlier, before you joined me, Angola was one of the last African countries to introduce a value-added tax, and that was in October 2019. Now, that tax replaced the consumption tax. What really was the difference that brought VAT around, or brought it to be, and that made it better as a choice overall than the continued consumption tax for Angola?
So the consumption tax was some form, or I can say value-added tax is some form of consumption tax, in the sense that it falls on the consumer of the items. It's the final person in the value chain who is liable to paying this tax. VAT is easily administered, so it's less complex than the ordinary consumption tax as it was, which looked more of a sales tax. So it's easier to administer, but they basically all fall down to the final consumer of the goods and service. The idea around VAT, to some extent, is to promote value addition along the value chain. So if you add value to a particular commodity and you're not the final consumer of the commodity, you can then be liable for a VAT refund or non-VAT payment. The final consumer, who's usually most of the people in the population, are the ones who actually pay this particular value-added tax. So the direction taken by Angola was one of, first of all, to improve on the already existing tax instrument that was there, the consumption tax, to move it to something that would promote more value addition along the value chain, and to make a tax payment that would be easier to administer than traditionally the consumption tax, which looked like a sales tax.
Okay. We know that the Angolan government adopted a slim approach in the implementation of VAT. That is simple, local, and modern. Now, for them, simple was establishing a broad scope for the tax with a reduced number of exemptions and with simplified tax calculations. For local, it was to be suitable for Angola's national reality and socioeconomic context. And the modern part was to have a digital component and also follow international best practices in dealing with tax fraud and evasion. Has this approach worked for Angola's VAT in the past 3 years? We've also saw that there was an introduction of some form of digital or electronic tax when this one also took off in October 1st, 2019.
The mixed approach has worked to a large extent, considering that Angola basically depends almost 40% of their GDP on the oil sector. About 37.8% of their GDP comes from the oil and refinery sector. This sector is usually very formal and very formalized. So having a mixed approach where you're taking a digital approach to VAT payments in this particular sector, and knowing that most of the oil that Angola produces does not end up being consumed in Angola, has worked out, because to some extent it's promoted value addition, and value addition makes you liable to be exempt of paying this particular value-added tax. Other than that, the retail sector contributes about 15.7% to the GDP of Angola. The retail sector, as it is known, is half formal and half informal. So having modernization of VAT payments, where you are even covering from what would be more of informal trading, has really worked out for Angola, and this might be one of the biggest attribution to the increase in the numbers of people who've been liable to paying VAT over the years. But of course, we do know that VAT is not necessarily the best tax instrument, because it's a consumption tax in nature. The biggest burden falls on the consumer. The consumer is everyone in society, regardless of whether you're employed or not employed. And it basically affects everyone in the population the same way. Angola's unemployment rates are 7.7%. So even this 7.7% of people who are unemployed and probably looking for opportunities here and there will still have a higher consumption basket because of that.
Sure. So we're seeing that now, 3 years after introducing the value-added tax, which stood at 14%, Angola's presidency has now said they're going to reduce that to 5%. The president said the measure falls within the scope of the country's macroeconomic stabilization process and will and should hopefully alleviate the current cost of living to Angolan families. This is a more than 50% cut in the value-added tax. And you yourself have just said that VAT is not necessarily the best tax overall because everyone pays regardless of income, regardless of being unemployed or not. At the end of the day, if you're buying certain products, you're paying that VAT. So what do you make of this reduction that Angola is aiming to kick off in 2022?
So the reduction is very welcome. So while we have VAT, we would want to have VAT at a low rate because of its impact on the consumption basket of everyone in society. The reduction from 14% to around 5%, 7% is very much welcome because it basically means that the basic consumption basket of goods and services for every of the 30 million Angolans reduces. Angolans will see a situation where in the long term they'll find themselves with more disposable income to stimulate spending, probably consumption spending on other goods and services, or to meet their needs and wants. This also somehow stimulates economic activity. And I think the rationale by the Angolan government of saying this is in line with development plans is, first of all, stimulating spending, consumption spending, stimulating economic activity from the savings that are made from this VAT. At first view, when you go into a shop and there's a reduction of VAT from 14% to 5%, you will not necessarily feel the impact then. But cumulatively, as you continue to consume goods and services at a lower VAT rate, you realize that you are making so many savings that you can rechannel these savings that you're making to more consumption spending. And this is exactly what the Angolan government wants. Angola is one of the most unequal countries in Africa and has quite a high cost of living. So a reduction in VAT is very much welcome because it reduces the cost of the basic needs basket, the ordinary basket that every one of the 33 million Angolans would want to consume, whether employed or part of the 7.7 that are unemployed.
So it's interesting you bring up the positives to this. One possible negative at the end of the day is going to be, of course, a drop in the VAT revenue. So let's look at the numbers. Angola collected 145 billion kwanzas in VAT per quarter, which was an increase from the 75 billion kwanzas that used to be collected per quarter as well. So with this VAT now going to 5%, we can see that there's going to be an obvious hit that VAT collection takes at the end of the day. And that, of course, is revenue that's going to be taken away from the national purse, less revenue to do things with. How does Angola plan to balance this or make up for the drop in VAT revenue? Are there any plans to bridge that gap between the revenue collected and what is now going to be available for the country to do anything with?
So, first of all, over the past 3 years, I think we started with a conversation around how the improvement in tax collection leads to improvement in tax compliance, which frees up more income. If you look at the trend over the years in tax collection, you see that some of this increase in taxes has been stated by the improvement in tax collection. That being said, more kwanzas can be collected from what I mentioned, which is the levels of income inequality that are in Angola. So they might be looking at probably introducing higher bands for personal income tax. Of course, the ones who will be liable to these are amongst the richest Angolans. They might want to improve more on administration of corporate income taxes. We talked about Angola almost having 40% of their GDP coming from the oil sector. There are lots of gaps that were reviewed from the Angola Leaks paper, which came out about 2 years ago, about how Angola has been failing to maximize some of the revenue from this sector due to corruption, tax incentives, and other non-tax payments, as it may. So there's lots of opportunity to improve administration in this sector and be able to cope up with some of the reductions in VAT. Reductions in VAT can also be said to have an effect of reduction in revenue, but the reality is that this revenue that's collected by the Angolan government is meant to be redistributed to try to alleviate poverty and to make things more affordable. The reduction in VAT can work as some sort of subsidy without having to go through government coffers and having government subsidize the cost of fuel, the cost of basic food items. So reduction in VAT itself is some form of subsidy and is some form of way that the Angolan government is improving welfare of the people, even with less revenue that would be realized from VAT collection.
So when this VAT was introduced in 2019, things like financial services, basic foodstuffs, books, education, healthcare, and medicine, as well as real estate, public transports, and petrol were exempted. Exports were categorized as zero rated for VAT. Now, the cut that's happening involves basic foodstuff and also extends to small and medium-sized boats, agricultural and industrial machinery and equipment. How broad do you think the implementation of the reduction will be? Do you think that with this going to 5% now, the list of things that are exempted will decrease, or will it remain the same?
It's probably going to look at an increase. You mentioned, of course, in 2019, some of the things that were exempt from the health and education sector were meant to improve welfare and well-being from the social sector side of things. You talked of exports being exempt. It was meant to probably promote the exportation and enhance trade for Angola. Right now, I think the focus comes out of the realization that Angola will not be as dependent on the oil and oil refinery sector as it has been on the past. Currently, we're seeing COP negotiations that are going on, and the biggest elephant in the room is around the energy transition and trying to extract less and less of fossil fuels. Angola has been thinking about that, and this is why some of the VAT exemptions have now been directed towards the agricultural sector, trying to see how it can improve on its agricultural sector and trying to see how it can even improve on its fisheries sector. Fisheries contributes about 1.9 to 2% of GDP. While there's lots of potential to contribute more, we do know that Angola's show cost is quite huge. There's lots of fishing potential there, and this is one sector that can make up for some of the losses that can come from the reduction in oil production and the phasing out of fossil fuels over the years. So the VAT has been extended, catering for both the essential commodities, food commodities that would be consumed by every ordinary Angolan, and also extended towards trying to see how the diversification in Angola can be achieved with the agricultural sector and fisheries sector being considered as among those sectors which would be strategic for Angola.
Okay. So we know as this tax is going down, there's an expectation that maybe one or two other taxes will actually be going up. So when this value-added tax came into force in 2019, the 14% rate was already one of the lowest in the Southern African Development Community. Now it's even going lower to about 5%. When you also look at that and you realize that Angola's overall goal is to broaden the tax base and make taxes the main source of revenue collection for the state, do you think that the country is in line, on course to achieve what their overall aim for taxation is?
The country is in line to achieve this, and probably other SADC countries and countries in Central Africa would want to go the Angola route. You see, you improve your revenue collection system, whether you have a rate of 5% or 14%, with the improvement of revenue collection systems, and if you have an improvement in the number of people who are compliant to pay tax, you see more and more tax being collected. This gives you room to ensure that you deliver on your government mandate, which is to improve the welfare of the people. So you can do this through a tax cut. VAT is regressive because of its effect on the consumption basket. So they're going in the right direction, improving revenue collection system to an extent where they can free up and lower rates to make sure that people are able to live comfortable lives and afford their basic needs basket at a lower rate, while government is also able to raise revenue. Angola, like most other countries in Southern Africa grappling with debt, has been talking about, of course, making taxes their number one source of revenue. And one way this can be done, and Angola has been looking at, is this very oil and gas sector, which is the biggest sector. How best can they be able to realize corporate income tax collections with the realization of revelation that came from Angola leaked paper? How best can they be able to manage their MDAs, their functions of government that generate revenue to be able to make up for this gap? So over the years, we'll probably see more focus on improved revenue administration and probably more focus on personal income taxes and corporate income taxes as ways in which Angola can make up for some of the losses that would come from the VAT section, which is very essential because of what it does to the economy, stimulating spending, stimulating economic warfare and economic activity, which is in line with the overall economic and development plan Angola has.
All right. We'll leave the conversation there. This is a review that the president announced is happening towards implementation of this in 2022. Angola moving its value-added tax from 14% to 5%. Mtwalo Msoni, we'll keep base with you watching this, how it develops, and see if any other countries in the region decide to pick this up. And again, of course, the developments around the conversation with taxation on the continent. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. Pleasure is mine.
All right. So we'll be wrapping things up with NC4 to watch right on the other side of this. We start in the eastern part of the continent with NC4 to watch. Now, the Central Bank of Kenya has announced the November bond issuance as it seeks to raise 50 billion Kenyan shillings for budgetary support. The sale will feature the reopening of the 20-year bond and issuance of a new 5-year fixed coupon treasury bond. The coupon rate for the 20-year reopened T bonds is pegged at 12.873%, while the 5-year T bonds will have a market-determined coupon rate. And staying in Kenya, borrowers in the country whose collateral value has depreciated will now be required to provide additional security as banks move to tighten lending terms. It is estimated that over $37.1 billion worth of securities held by big banks are tied in real estate, amid reports that the value of some of these properties has dropped. Now moving to the southern part of the continent, South African fuel prices will hit record highs from Wednesday, with the price of petrol spiking to over 19 rand a litre in the economic hub of Gauteng and other inland provinces. This comes as the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy announced on Monday night that the price of petrol will increase by 1 rand 23 a litre and diesel by 1 rand 48 a litre as of November the 3rd. And the African Development Bank has partnered with the Global Center on Adaptation to raise over $25 billion to promote climate-smart digital technologies to enhance agriculture and food security. The partnership also establishes the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program aimed at supporting the development of climate-resilient urban infrastructure. And that's it on Business Edge. Follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Download our mobile app. And of course, head to our website if you want to stay in touch with all the latest news and information from here on the continent. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru, Balogun. Till next time.